Today's talk is going to be about, can one imagine Sisyphus happy? Now this question roots from Albert Camus' one of his last lines in his philosophical work, The Myth of Sisyphus. And he is quoted saying, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." If you guys don't know the story or the myth behind Sisyphus, well, Sisyphus was a king that was condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a hill, and then only for it to roll down that hill, and then for him to push it up again for eternity. Strikingly enough, Albert Camus would say that this is absurd, but there is something freeing about the absurdness of this. However, I know a lot of people would find this disagreeable about how is it possible within this absurdity to imagine Sisyphus being happy. I mean, it sounds like utter hell. But the way that I want to approach Sisyphus is not the way that Albert Camus approached Sisyphus, but more about it's more about, in my opinion, what's interesting about this whole line is that Albert Camus is ordering us in some fashion that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Must imagine. Why is that in order? Why does the imagining become some kind of obligation? Because then that says that we're not very good translators, or we're not very good readers of our own lives. One thing that I love about psychoanalysis, when you start reading Freud and Carl Jung and all the rest of them, I mean, a more contemporary, you could say, is Adam Phillips. I probably have some trauma because I really love Adam Phillips. So there's probably some trauma behind why I love Adam Phillips. But nonetheless, what I continue to love about Adam Phillips is that he will phrase questions that will kind of use the same word. And what do I mean by that is, for example, what is it about our unwillingness to imagine that is unwilling? It's questions like that. Or to give another example, Adam Phillips quotes Oscar Wilde in Forbidden Pleasures, in actually the book Unforbidden Pleasures. My bad. He quotes Oscar Wilde saying, or being asked by someone else actually, about, well, don't you think morality is important? And Oscar Wilde replies, well, yes, I just don't think importance is. Things like that, that's very interesting to me. Because when Albert Camus says that one must imagine Sisyphus happy, what is it about imagination that we can't imagine? And as you can tell, that leaves me with a great pause, because I just don't know. I just don't know. And I think that right there says a lot. Because there's something very omniscient about the way we think about certain situations, about the way that they should be like. And the first thing that we assume about how this experience should be felt and told is that Sisyphus clearly shouldn't be happy, right? That line in our minds goes completely unquestioned. We instantly tell ourselves that Sisyphus could not be happy. It would be impossible for him to be happy. And this is why I think psychoanalysis is so useful. Is because in the myth of Sisyphus, there is something deeply sadomasochistic about it. And I think Albert Camus exploits it perfectly. Because there is something deeply pleasurable about our suffering. And Freud talks about this too. And that's why because here's the thing. When we desire something, it's not only that we can imagine the satisfaction for it. And that's why we're also frustrated. But it's also because we're willing to suffer for it. So there's a lot of things going on between this. Is that, as Adam Phillips would say, is that once I'm frustrated, it's because I can imagine the satisfaction that I could get from this. But then also at the same time, I'm willing to suffer for that. Because I can't imagine the satisfaction. And I think the problem that we have with imagining Sisyphus being happy is more about the way we look at happiness. If we look at happiness positively, I'm not even sure if I'm saying it positively. Yeah, I think that's a word. If we look at happiness this way, we can see that it's very hard or very difficult to just imagine. Because honestly, happiness is really a finite state of being. But if we make happiness our object of desire, we're always willing to suffer for it. And that's what's always very paradoxical about people that say that they want to be happy. Is that ironically, they're probably the most miserable people. Yet, it's the drive of happiness that keeps them going. The drive for happiness that keeps them going. And in many ways, that is very similar to Sisyphus. There's something miserable about the way that he has to constantly push up that boulder and then watch it go down for him to push it up again for eternity. But there's also something deeply pleasurable about that as well. And I think that's something that we don't talk about. And I'm not really sure that it's absurd. I mean, I know the label for Albert Camus' philosophical category is called absurdism. And that he didn't quite call himself an existentialist. He never accepted that label. But what I like about Albert Camus is that he at least sees, he does something similar along the lines of psychoanalysis. He redescribes in a very radical way about meaning that is worth paying attention to. Because what I like, and the way that he does this is very significant in my opinion. And I think Albert Camus is very underrated for this. Because psychologically, I think he did a great move. A move that really mattered. And the reason why I say this also is because it's what helped him live his life. And I think if we look at Albert Camus and the way he redescribed having no meaning for life, he turned it into a pleasure. How does one do that? And that is the most, I think, a most amazing feature about redescribing your life. And this is why I have a fascination with psychoanalysis. It's because you can exactly do that. You have the ability to redescribe. Words are not simply words. Words, as Freud will tell us in one of his earlier writings, words are magic. But they've kind of lost that, and it's time to bring that back into the picture. Albert Camus said that life is meaningless, but it doesn't mean that life is not worth living. Now that's a big distinction there. Because somehow the divide that Albert Camus made was that it doesn't necessarily translate that if you decide life is meaningless, that life is not worth living. In fact, you could look at it the other way around. It's because life is meaningless that actually makes your life worth living. It's because it's meaningless that your life is worth living. To some degree, it almost sounds like he's saying that you could just make your meaning, and that's why it's worth living. Because if the meaning was already made, then it would be like some kind of fatalism. But Albert Camus was very careful, and he was very much against what he called philosophical suicide. Was that we shouldn't close the book. And that's why meaning should always be meaningless. Because the moment you've given your life a kind of meaning, you've stopped interpreting your life. You've stopped the conversation. And that's what psychoanalysis will try to teach. And I think in a very strange way, when you read Albert Camus, that's exactly what Albert Camus was trying to say. And this is exactly where you will find your most freedom. Is that whatever you do, you can't stop interpreting. You can't give anything a final say. Because the joy of life is that we can have this conversation. And that we can always, again, look at what we've previously said, and reinterpret it. And in this reinterpretation, one could imagine, one must imagine, Sisyphus happy. And it's in that interpretation or reinterpretation that is made possible. And I think that's the part that's always been missed. When we fail to constantly interpret. I mean, this is what I really enjoy about Freud in general, is that Freud has always advocated for over-interpreting experiences, over-interpreting anything. Because once you over-interpret something, it just never ends. I mean, the possibilities are always there. Once you under-interpret something, that's when the tragedy begins. And that's why, as you can see, the myth of Sisyphus is such a good myth to talk about, because it shows us how bad we are as interpreters. That we give it one interpretation and we're willing to accept it. And I would say that's more the tragedy of our own lives, and the tragedy of ourselves as interpreters. But anyways, I hope that was enlightening in some fashion to talk about and think about and reflect upon, because it definitely caused me a lot of reflection when I connected Albert Camus and psychoanalysis. Alright guys, take care.